Welcome to Off the Grid, a podcast for small business owners who want to leave social media without losing all their clients.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go off the grid. Okay. I know that you really want to put your phone away. Yeah. Let's go off the grid.
Hello and welcome back to Off the Grid. I'm Amelia Fruby. I am the founder of Softer Sounds Podcast Studio and the host of this show, where we talk about running creative businesses with radical generosity, energetic sovereignty, and no or minimal social media presence. If you're new to the show, thanks for being here and joining us for season 4. I want to make sure that you know about our free Leaving Social Media Toolkit. This free toolkit includes a 5-step plan for leaving any social platform, my list of 100 ways to share your work off social media, and a super fun database for planning seasonal creative marketing experiments. Those tools pair with the first 4 episodes of the show, and they're completely free. So again, if you're a new listener, welcome, and please head to the show notes to grab the free toolkit today. If you're a returning listener, welcome back to the show. Today, I'm having a conversation that I think you're really going to enjoy because we're going to lean into talking about the creative side of creative business. I think personally that my wheelhouse and Off the Grid is all of the business and marketing strategies that help us spread the word about our creative businesses and make money in our creative businesses. But maybe what I'm not so good at or need more support with is cultivating our creative capacity, tending to our creative energy, and becoming the creative people that I think we all inherently are, but that many of us require more support and resources to become or to live out in our day-to-day lives. So today I'm joined by a guest who specializes in all of these aspects of creativity and who's here to, I think, help us all kind of stoke our inner creative fire a bit and allow that to shine through in our businesses. So let me introduce you to today's guest. Pascale is a neurocomplex, queer, quietly rebellious, multi-hyphenate creative, and all-around unconventional human being. She lives in Montreal, where she coaches creative people to work with their creative minds instead of against them. She's in the process of writing a book, and she speaks French, English, Spanish, and some Portuguese. Today, she's here to talk about creative resilience and everything that comes with it. Welcome, Pascale. I'm so thrilled to have you on the podcast.
I'm so excited for this conversation and really grateful to be here. I'm a fan of the podcast, so it just feels extra special to be on that side of the mic today.
I want to take us right into the thick of it, I think, and ask if you could kick us off by defining creative resilience. Like, what is it and why does it matter?
Absolutely. And I love that you reminded all of the listeners of our inherent ability to be creative. And I kind of want to remind each and every one of us here that we are all creatives. And especially for the listeners of this podcast and for members of your community who are brave enough to consider at least stepping away or already have stepped away from social media, which is the norm to market your business. And they're brave enough to kind of explore what else might work for them. They question, they challenge things. And for me, that is creativity. It's this ability to see what else is out there and ask yourself what else might be true, to reimagine certain things. So if people are listening to the podcast, good news, you are creative. And for me, creativity is really about transformation. It's turning one thing into something different. And it's this ability to kind of generate new ideas, new solutions, combining new elements together to come up with something else. And I love seeing it more as a skill and a muscle that you can train and you can nurture. So I kind of want to start there just to give ourselves the perspective, just zoom out of what you might think creativity is about before we even get into creative resilience, and focusing again on this ability to come up with solutions. And then when we look at what resilience is, for me, it's being able to adapt and to recover from any challenges that might come our way, whether it is obstacles or maybe feedback or criticism. It's being able to keep going despite the very real and very valid obstacles that are on our path and being flexible with it. So there's also this element of discerning, depending on what comes my way, the challenge, the feedback, the criticism, to know, am I being asked to pivot or am I being asked to maybe stay even more grounded in my vision, even when progress is slow? So for me, it's really about being this very compassionate and curious problem solver, which we're all good at being, being creatives. So creative resilience here is really this ability that we can cultivate to return to our center when we face obstacles. It's being more in a response posture rather than a reactive place. I'll speak for myself and for people that I work with, but often we tend to, when we face challenges, either give up on our goal and kind of decide, oh, this is failure, or we tend to give up on ourselves and maybe bypass some of our needs to kind of force or push through certain things. Resilience is really more about being in this response posture and ask ourselves, okay, this is what's present here. What can I do with it? So we choose to pause and to observe what is here, consider some options, and then consciously choose a new course of action. So when you kind of put them together, creative resilience for me is really the art of managing change and transition and disruption. And it's the skill to reimagine something. So kind of responding to the new elements that come in and being able to play with it. And it's a very important skill for creatives in general and to business owners as well. I think it's really essential.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you for sharing all of that. I really appreciate how you grounded us in what creativity is, what resilience is. And really what I was hearing and what you were sharing is this way that we are invited to imagine and reimagine over and over again. And I think that is the artistic process. But there's something for me too in creative resilience of how we need creative resilience to navigate all the ways that our work meets the world. So once you start sharing your work, you're going to get that feedback, like you mentioned, and it could be positive or it could be constructive or it could be straight up negative, or it may not feel like feedback, but it may just be like, it doesn't sell. And you're like, okay, well, that's the kind of feedback. And we want to cultivate creative resilience so that we can navigate those obstacles. Or even, I think, navigate our own success. It doesn't have to be a negative obstacle or a challenge necessarily. It could be that, wow, you made this work and it was super successful or people loved it and you sold out. And then now all of a sudden, like, can you make a whole new body of work really quickly? There are a lot of ways that our creativity is impacted once we start sharing our work in the world, and our process shifts as our work meets the world. And I think that creative resilience is important to learn how to cultivate kind of for literally everyone who's doing creative work in their life and their business. And that said, the reason I wanted to have this conversation now is because so many of the business owners that I speak to who are like brilliant, creative spirits and strategic thinkers and all of these things are struggling to understand how to navigate the current market, as also, I guess I'll say, like, how do we navigate this time where there are so many things happening in the world, where people's buying patterns and behaviors are really shifting, where marketing strategies we relied on in the past don't work anymore. I just hear from a lot of people, it's like, I don't know how to share my work or how to package my creative work in a way that I can feel resourced and supported in my business. And often, this is where folks will come to me and they want like a new marketing tactic. They're like, I'm having a problem. Can you tell me, like, should I make a course? I have heard this so many times. The business isn't going well. I should probably make a course. That's right. That's probably the answer. And I will say, rarely is that the answer. Unfortunately, I wish it was that easy that we could all just make a course and it would solve all our business problems. But where I actually want to send them is more often like to you to work on creative resilience, because that's what's coming up, this creative problem solving. So I'm curious how you work on creative resilience with your clients. Like, what are the ways that you see this coming up in people's practice or in their businesses, and some of the maybe common creative blocks that you're working with folks or around on with folks?
Yeah, and I love your perspective on it. And also what you just shared about, like, it's so easy to maybe navigate some type of challenge or feedback or even just crickets in your business and think, oh, well, I might need to kind of jump on a new marketing strategy or tactic or launch a course. I think I hear that often as well. And I think what might be more helpful in any type of business that you're starting or growing is to cultivate that little muscle of resilience, because the world of business comes with so much unknown and uncertainty and change. So being able to kind of hold yourself steady as all those different twists and turns happen is even more important than figuring out the new strategy. And I think I'm going to speak for myself, but it might be your case as well. But I had multiple different businesses. It feels like I had so many different lives. And I tried something. I faced some challenges. I learned from it. And then I used those insights to inform what was next. That's basically how I kept going and I kept building new things. And I think that's really, really important as a skill, because it helps you handle uncertainty and unknown, but also focus on finding solutions rather than overthinking the problem. And I think a weird image that comes to mind right now, and we'll see where it takes us, but it feels as though resilience is kind of the ability, let's say you're driving on the highway and you know where you're going, you have a destination in mind. You can't control the traffic. You cannot control other cars. There are things kind of coming your way. You need to be aware of what's around you, but you still need to be grounded in this is where I'm going, and quickly be able to create a new path in your mind if ever you come across some type of traffic or whatever that might be. Whereas I think it's often easy to, let's say, look in the rearview mirror and focus on the other cars. And in that image, what I'm trying to illustrate is focusing on the problem. We're not getting closer to the destination. We need to be aware of them. We don't need to deny that it's present, but we still need to be focused on where we're going and what our destination is. Something that I love doing with my clients is building what I call micro-resilience practices. We don't have to wait for challenges to come our way so that we train that muscle. We can kind of implement some type of small-scale practice, like a practice space to grow that muscle. So we're kind of controlling the environment where we're playing with discomfort. We're playing with the unknown or uncertainty or some type of feedback. And we're learning to stretch this comfort zone, but also to grow that muscle in a way that we're kind of controlling some variables here. So that might look like taking any type of action that's low risk, but it's uncomfortable, so that you can stretch yourself and tolerate this discomfort. And you're exposing yourself to a potential challenge or maybe some type of criticism or rejection, and you're training your brain to recover, but you're kind of, again, controlling some environments. So maybe that looks like putting a time constraint on the project. Maybe it's even picking up an old project that you kind of gave up on and you're finding a new solution with it. Maybe it's just challenging yourself to talk to a stranger today, or to try a new recipe, or to ask for feedback from someone that feels safe to you. And you're playing with that type of discomfort. You can create some type of like scale from 1 to 10 of what feels uncomfortable, and use those different little practices to train that muscle outside of your business. create a sacred container for it to help you grow that muscle instead of kind of waiting for things to happen and then not really knowing how to respond. But it's, again, just controlling a bit of that uncertainty or unknown and training your brain to think, okay, if this happens, then I'm going to do this.
Yeah, I love this practice. It reminds me so much of working with like your window of tolerance in a nervous system framework where you're kind of trying to expand it a bit so that you have the capacity to be with discomfort and to navigate that. And often in that work, it's like your window of tolerance may start very small. You actually can't handle much discomfort or much challenge. And then over time, as you self-regulate and learn to soothe and all these things, you can expand it. And it had never occurred to me to apply that in the way that you're talking about, to cultivate resilience as a skill. Yeah, I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but it feels so true. And it feels a bit obvious. I'm like, of course, if I think creativity is something we can cultivate, I think resilience is something we can cultivate. I really like the examples you gave for doing this in other areas of our life, for, speaking to a stranger or saying hi to someone out in public that maybe you engage with all the time but don't actually have a conversation with. I'm also thinking of ways that I think we can do this within our businesses. It's like, can you send the email to invite a guest on your podcast? Who knows if they'll respond? Maybe they'll say no, but can you just practice sending it? It's very low stakes if they come on your podcast or not, but you can try. You can put yourself out there. That makes it easier to send the email to set a boundary with a client over time, or makes it easier to send the email to end a project that needs to go away, right? If it's like my window of tolerance for scary emails. That's what's happening in my brain. I'm like, I have a scale of 1 to 10 for how scary is the email to send. If I start at 1, then just email my mom, then I can move to 2 and email a friend, and I can go all the way up to sending an email that's I don't think we should work together anymore, and I'm going to end this business relationship. And so I love that you're inviting us to practice this, in other areas of our lives. And then I'm just also seeing ways that we can practice it in our business too, and cultivate, in those examples of sort of communicative resilience, but also I think creative resilience around sharing our work. Sometimes, you can build that spectrum for who is it most comfortable to share with and who is it least comfortable to share with or most uncomfortable to share with. And then how can you kind of expand that window or take yourself down that path where you can be sharing in ways that in the past may have felt completely impossible to you or to others.
Absolutely. And I think what comes to mind right now as I'm listening to you is how often we tend to have those big goals or action steps that we need to be taking in our business for things to move. And because we feel in our nervous system, it's such a big step for us and it's so uncomfortable that we kind of stay very small and grounded where we are, instead of maybe asking ourselves, okay, this step is very scary. I'm not going to judge it. It's normal that it's scary. How can I make it easier for myself to get there? How can I create some type of scale to eventually for it to not feel as scary, and break it down into smaller little practices in order to get there? So if that email to send to a podcast feels so out of your comfort zone, well, maybe there's other ways that you can train that muscle and eventually get there. So I absolutely love the example that you brought up here. And I know that you had asked me about creative blocks as well a little earlier. And I think it's very related here in terms of how these show up. So creative blocks, we can think about common ones are self-doubt or perfectionism, procrastination, imposter syndrome, fear of failure or fear of success. Pretty sure a lot of us will resonate with one or many of those. And I think those tend to come up when we're faced with exactly what we've talked about here, which is it feels like a very big stretch in our nervous system, and we might be in some type of stress response here. So those blocks I think it's important to see them for what they are. They're simply protective parts of us that show up when they sense they might be needed. And they show up with the only strategy they know. And often that's not the most helpful one. It tends to kind of keep us safe in a certain comfort zone with weird strategies like being very mean to ourselves or delaying some type of action or convincing ourselves that we're a fraud or that something's going to be very scary. So it keeps us in that very safe little space, which can be dangerous for people that are creatives because we need to be able to constantly reimagine certain things and get outside of that comfort zone and that little box that we might force fit ourselves into. And where I'm getting at with that is I think it's pretty common to hear, oh, destroy your inner critic or overcome procrastination or banish perfectionism. That's not my approach at all. So I kind of want to offer that reframe for the listeners if ever that speaks to them. And just shifting it more in terms of how can I work with it? It's going to show up. It's a protective part of you that is important, but it's to be a little more curious in order to understand why this story is here so we can work and collaborate with that part of yourself and partner up with it instead of kind of fighting against it. And again, another weird image that pops up. We'll see where it takes us. We never know. But it feels as though, let's say we take perfectionism as an example. It might be more helpful to kind of create space at your creative desk for perfectionism to sit with you as you create, instead of spending your entire creative time trying to force it out the door. So you're kind of fighting against it. And at the end of the day, you didn't make anything. You didn't create anything. You were investing all your energy trying to get rid of it and make it wrong, rather than maybe creating space for it at the creative desk. And I feel like the more we do that and we create despite it being here, the more eventually this part of us is going to see, oh, interesting. I don't feel as needed anymore. It might shift in the type of job that they want to play in our lives.
I can just imagine so many ways that we can sit with perfectionism or procrastination or fear or imposter syndrome in a literal sense. Like, I love that you brought this to like, put it on your desk. And that could be anything. Like, you could have literally a piece of paper that just has perfectionism written on it that's just there with you. Or it could be a little talisman that you get, or a particular rock from wherever, or a candle, whatever it might be, like, but having this sort of physical, tangible object and sitting with that quite literally, instead of, I'll often use it metaphorically, like, well, I'll just sit with it in myself. But if we can externalize it a bit, then we can engage with it differently instead of feeling any pressure to, as you're talking about, just like repress it, ignore it, banish it, as you said. And I would agree, in my own experience, it's always been so much more supportive and transformational to engage with these creative blocks directly than it has been to just tell myself they're bad and they should go away. Like, that doesn't actually do anything. Believing it should go away doesn't make it go away. It then just becomes something for me to shame myself about, because then I feel ashamed that I haven't gotten it to go away yet. And so, I can just see so many ways we can do this in our businesses. I think around creative blocks, but also just more broadly, so many of us struggle to relate to money in our business, and we could use this sort of practice for that. We could use this practice with clients. We could have representatives for our clients on our workspace with us if we so wanted. But I really appreciate that as a method of engaging them. And I can also see how over time that can really shift, because I think for me, perfectionism, the more I engaged with it, I realized, well, it comes from this desire for excellence. And I think that that's actually really healthy and motivating in my creative practices. And I can let go of like the trappings of being perfect that get piled onto that and keep like the center of it, this like desire to always be improving my craft, to create things that are excellent for others. And that can stay. And if I just get rid of perfectionism altogether, it can be hard to recover what's in there, like what's actually like the seed of this that is supportive and is motivating and generative for me.
I love that you bring that up. I think it's a very, very important thing to mention here, because at the very core, like underneath all of those weird strategies that it that it decides to take, the intention of it is always to serve us in some way. Otherwise, they would not be here. But it's the strategies that they choose that might not be very aligned to our bigger intention of growing, let's say. But at the core of it, perfectionism in your case shows up because there is this drive for excellence, which is a beautiful intention. It's just, okay, now that I know that, how can I support that need and that intention in a different way? So I love that you brought that up. It's really important.
Hey there, Off the Grid listener. Amelia here, interrupting this episode because I have an amazing book rec for you from this week's sponsor. On this show, we talk about leaving social media without losing all your clients. But I know that many of our listeners, maybe even you, are still on social media and you're trying to find ways to stay on the apps without feeling that soul-sucking dread that can come along with the doom scroll. If you wish you could quit social media, but you can't right now for any old reason, I want to recommend an amazing book that's just come out called The Art of Thriving Online by Amelia Knott. This is a workbook full of creative exercises to help you stay grounded and feel joy in the world of social media. And it helps you create a conscious relationship with the online world, one that allows you to enjoy the many benefits of staying connected through social media, while also centering in a feeling of self-awareness and choice. This book goes far beyond quote-unquote digital detoxing and instead shares innovative methods for counteracting the manipulative, compulsive, and stress-inducing aspects of social media while preserving the goodness of your time online. I love that it's written by another Amelia and that the foundation of her method is creativity. This workbook is playful, it's interactive, it's positive, it promotes mental health and digital wellness, and I just can't recommend it enough. Head to the show notes to grab the link and get your copy of The Art of Thriving Online today, or head to your local bookstore and request a copy there. I think that you'll really love it, and I'm so glad that we got to share it on the show. Okay, now let's get back into today's episode. I want to bring social media into this conversation because, well, one, this is off the grid, so that's what we talk about. But two, I think that social media can really, in some instances, like create or cause creative blocks, and in others, just really aggravate or exacerbate things that we may have already been feeling in some sense. To share from my own experience, I would often, when I was on Instagram, which is years ago now, but when I was active there, I would spend a lot of time kind of like scrolling around for what I would have said was inspiration. But what I was probably really doing is just like looking at what other people were doing and then comparing myself to them, and then feeling this bundled, jumbled mess of like a failure, and I was envious, and I felt like I wouldn't stack up, and I had imposter syndrome. Like all of this just got like tangled into one big knot the more that I scrolled and compared and looked at what other people were doing. And when I left social media, that pretty quickly went away. I'm not saying that I don't ever land on someone's website and feel a sense of like, maybe my work's not good enough. Like that still happens occasionally, but much less often. And I'm much better able to regulate around it because I'm not literally encountering like dozens and dozens of these images all the time by scrolling. So that's just one way that I think social media caused some of my own creative blocks. Like I'd get to that place, I'd be that like jumbled mess of creative blocks and feelings. And then I would just like not be able to create anything for days or weeks or months because I had gotten so like locked into my head. And then I would just get further pulled into the app and just spend more and more time doing that. And eventually I would somehow have to pull myself out of it to get back to my creative work. And I think that the other piece of that, it's not just the creative blocks, but it's also the resilience. Like I feel like the more time I spent on social media, almost like the less resilient I was, like the more I got pulled into the algorithm. I feel like that impacted my ability to imagine doing things differently. Like all I could imagine doing is what I was seeing other people doing. And then I would just compare myself to those things. And as I think this podcast evidences, like it wasn't until I left social media that I was able to kind of get out of those ways of thinking and actually imagine something like new and different and interesting for myself. So I'm curious what you see in your creative practice or with your clients around like how does social media impact their creative blocks or creative resilience? And are there any ways that you help them navigate that?
Social media is such a fascinating little universe, isn't it? And bold claim here, but I think it's a very dangerous place sometimes for creativity in general and creatives because of many reasons. Some of the reasons that come to mind right now is this constant output, like this kind of urgency to always be producing something at a very fast pace, following some very arbitrary metrics that are external. And if you kind of put all of that together, the need to constantly be creating something extremely fast with very high standards or metrics that might have nothing to do with how you would measure success, it puts you in a place where you don't, as you said, you don't challenge yourself. You keep following rules, you conform, you blend in. And so you're in this space where you might not be kind of quote unquote failing when it comes to the platform, but you also don't succeed in your creativity because you keep avoiding risk and failure and being different. And it puts you in a place where you're not equipped to train that muscle of resilience or to innovate in any way. And I think also the thing with social media, or the things I would say, is you're always exposed to the final outcome. Let's say in a creative project, it's very rare that you see the work in progress or the process of something. And so if you constantly see the final result in a creative project, but you're at home in your creative space and you're halfway through the process and it doesn't look good, it doesn't sound good yet, it's easy to feel like you're failing or you're not doing something right. So there's also, I think, on social media, this pressure to be liked by the algorithm. And creativity is just really about not following the norm. So already here, it forces you into conformity in some way, but you're just also training the opposite muscle of creativity. I'm not sure if that's clear, but not only you're not training creativity, but you're kind of training another part of your brain that is kind of the opposite of it. And when you're on social media and you have this information overload, this amount of information and data that comes to you at a very, very fast pace, chances are it's going to create some type of overwhelm. And then in that space of overwhelm and overthinking, it's very easy to fuel those creative blocks that we've talked about because you're in that stress response and you're going for that coping strategy, which might be any of the blocks that we've talked about. So already it kind of creates that environment for those creative blocks to be fueled. There's comparison, there's self-doubt, there's distraction from your own goal. And if you put all of that together, what I think it does in a nutshell is to kind of train you to be externally resourced. You're always looking outside of yourself to measure some type of success. You're also in that echo chamber of, the more you click on certain things, the more you're kind of in that filter bubble. And it reinforces some of your pre-existing beliefs and perspectives and ideas, which is kind of dangerous when you think about creativity because creativity will come when you're exposed to new ideas, new perspectives, new beliefs. You challenge yourself. But if you're in that kind of filter bubble where it's always the same thing that's being reinforced, it's very difficult to train that creative muscle.
Two things really stood out to me in what you were saying. One is this way that social media both encourages and I think to some degree demands conformity. And I've talked a little bit before on the podcast about just kind of like the memification of these platforms, by which I mean like literal memes that we can all make, but also it's this process of creating more and more of the same and kind of over time, just attuning all of our work toward this sort of like norm that we're engaging. And I think there are many norms active on social media, depending on the communities that you're in. But once you find your space, then like kind of everyone's creating work toward the same norm. It's all conforming. I think the other piece that you mentioned that I thought was really important was the way that on social media, we are like trying to be externally resourced and validated at all times. And what that brought up for me is that creative resilience cannot come from the outside. We can't get it from there. We can't receive it from other people. We can't receive it from likes. We have to find it within ourselves. And so social media is not a place where we can develop it. Maybe it's a place we can test our creative resilience based on the feedback that we're getting or not getting, but it's not a place that we can really build it or like develop it in the first place. Like that's an internal resource. It cannot be externally created for us.
Yeah, those micro resilience practices that we talked about earlier, that can be a great space to test some things, but it's definitely not a place where it's easy to build that muscle at all. I think there are ways to engage with it that can eventually help us train our creative resilience. But I think it's really important to come to that space with some type of boundaries or like holding ourselves steady. And to get there, it's really important to spend time with yourself reflecting on your own vision and be clear about what you want and also what pace feels comfortable for you and kind of set guidelines around that. And defining what success might look like for you and how you're going to kind of measure it. So redefining some KPIs here instead of the final outcome. Am I more measuring in this season of my life? Could be I'm building that skill, or I want to find joy in the process, or I want to feel more present with my work. I think it's important to create your own milestones so that you can build that inner validation. So even if you're engaging on social media and some things are coming your way, you have something to filter out some of that feedback that might not be addressed to you, but unconsciously, it's like when you're a creative person and you're maybe doing something that's out of the norm, or you're being someone that's a bit different, there's this constant feedback, even if it's not verbal and clear, in the images that are out there and you're not really relating to it or you can't see yourself in it. It's easy to feel unconsciously, constantly like rejected or this negative type of feedback. But if you already build that clear vision, guidelines, this is how I measure success. Those are going to be my KPIs. Those are my milestones to measure my success. It might be a bit easier to handle whatever comes our way in this weird universe of social media.
Yeah, I really love this. I think something I come back to again and again on the show is that you have to know what you want. Like, I just think that's so important. And I think it's really under-supported in our society, like actually creating the space to connect with your desire and to know what it is that you really want, not what you're told you should want, not what path you've like somehow ended up on, but what you actually want. And something else I like to remind people of, or maybe I haven't said this so clearly, but will say now, is that like when you're on social media, likes are the currency on a platform like Instagram, but they're actually not valuable anywhere else. Or maybe another way to think about that is likes are only valuable to influencers. Influencers are the only people who can sell their likes for dollars. As a small business owner, you're not selling your likes for dollars. You're trying to use your likes as a proxy for getting people to buy your stuff. And it's a really bad one, frankly. Like, it's very disconnected. It's not a good proxy at all. And so I think that so often when creative people spend time on social media, like we're talking about how this impacts your resilience, how this impacts your relationship to your work, how this impacts your creative blocks, but also as you're bringing in success now, like it has you measuring all the wrong things. And unless you want to be an influencer, like unless your goal is to sell engagement for money, which is what influencers do in a certain sense, it can't be your metric for success. It's a horrible metric for success, but it's such an easy one to get caught up in when these metrics are really highlighted on these platforms. And I mean, I understand that there are ways that likes or follower counts bring us social capital and that they can be, in a certain sense, like traded for things we desire, perhaps like a record contract, thinking particularly now like TikTok. So it's not that it's useless to some people, but I think that if what you want to be is a business owner, which is who I like to speak to on this show, like if your goal is to sell your own goods and make money from them, you're not trying to trade your influence for a contract. You're not trying to sell your likes to brands. And so it's really important. Like, I love that you gave us some examples of like, what are other metrics of success that you can have for yourself? Could it be how many works you create in this season? Could it be how many hours you spend in your studio this year? Those to me are very like sort of intrinsic measures of success, things that you have control over, things that you are doing. Also, there are other ways that we can measure success that do bring in that external input. I think in a business, revenue is often a metric of success, or profit is a metric of success. For me on the podcast, I do look at downloads. I do pay attention to if the show is growing, but I'm not immediately comparing my downloads to other shows. It's like I'm comparing it to myself. How many downloads did I have last season? How many do I have this season, right? Like I'm trying to grow over time as opposed to constantly being like looking around at what everyone else is doing and then only knowing if I'm growing based on how much they're growing. Like that's a very different way of assessing my creative practice and output.
Different vibe. It's more of like creating this little fun game with yourself rather than being in a very stressful competition. And I think going back to success, it's true in every situation. I think it's even more noticeable on social media, but it might also be the case for someone in a 9-to-5 job or anywhere else in life when it comes to any of the milestones that you can think of, having kids, getting married, this and that. If you don't spend enough time to be curious with yourself as to like, what do you want and what is successful for you, it's very easy to follow someone else's definition of success and then inevitably get lost because that's not your own path. And I think it can be very intimidating for a lot of people, that question of what do you want? Because we're not used to asking ourselves this question. But if ever that brings up a bit of anxiety, what I would say to someone listening to this conversation now is just maybe defining it for yourself today or this week or this month or this season. It doesn't have to be the ultimate, what do you want for your life kind of question. It might be easier to think about it in the moment, but it is really important to set that definition and guidelines for you to get into different spaces and stay anchored and grounded in where you're going and who you are.
Yeah, I really appreciate that addendum because I absolutely do not know what I want for my whole life. That's a huge, I don't know. I sort of know what I want for the next few years. That's about all I have at any given time. But I think too, what you're talking about, like grounding, setting your direction, going way back to like the car metaphor you're on, like, where are you going? This is helping me clarify what I mean when I say you have to know what you want. I think it's a combination of knowing where you're headed, having that orientation, like this is what I think the end goal is. And then knowing the sort of seeds of like, what are the deepest desires here? And then as all of that plays out, like as those desires start to flourish, as that direction gets clearer, you might change path to stay connected to the desires. The desires might shift as you actually get closer to the thing that you wanted. So for example, for me in starting a business, like the desire was a lot of time freedom and financial abundance. Like that's really what I wanted. And that has guided how I have grown Softer Sounds and Off the Grid over the past few years. And things have changed a lot in that time. I did not know Off the Grid would become a big part of my work when I started it. I had no clue. I've started other podcasts that have not become a big part of my work. It's not. So it's a little bit of co-creation. Knowing what you want is not about deciding right now exactly every piece of how it will look and then like forcing your way toward that outcome. But I think it's the sort of orientation, like setting off on the path you want to go on and knowing what's most important to you along the way so you can stay true to those things, even as, the highway changes, takes its own journey. There are potholes, whatever, to use this to expand this metaphor.
Yeah, and I think it ties in very nicely to our topic today about resilience, because it's also important to, yes, stay grounded and focused on the destination and be aware of our desires, but it's this ability to also be flexible and open to whatever comes our way and kind of using that to pivot, to change directions if ever we need to. And I think it requires you to have this ability to filter out what doesn't serve you. So you have to kind of be aware of, where am I open to receiving feedback, and where do I feel very confident and grounded in what I want, so that you can easily kind of, all right, that's interesting. That's part of the work or part of my life or whatever, that I was open for it to shift and change. And there are things that I feel pretty confident about. For now, I'm not really open to changing it. And it's important to be clear on that, so that whatever comes your way, whatever type of feedback, criticism, challenges, you're able to not take everything in and make it this huge problem that you need to be fixing right away. It's okay. This yes, this no. It's like this job of discernment and kind of filtering out things.
Absolutely. I feel like this is something I tried to get at in my Am I a Business Owner or an Artist episode, because I think there are kind of two different modalities here. It's like, as artists, it's so important to stay grounded in what you are creating and doing. And like, your vision comes from within and moves out. But as business owners, like if you go to a business class, particularly in my experience, like in the tech space, you're really taught to like look outside of you and identify like a quote unquote hole in the market. And then like get a ton of like user interviews around that, and then kind of spin up an MVP product, minimum viable product, and then like iterate and test around that, and then get tons of feedback, and then totally change it based on the feedback. Like, it's all external. Like, you're doing everything out there so that you can create something that other people are telling you they want. And these are two totally different ways of creating things. And I think that as creative business owners, we've given ourselves the beautiful, incredibly challenging task of doing both at the same time. We're trying to have our vision within us that we're bringing to the outside, and then also navigate, as you're saying, like feedback. Because as creative business owners, we want our work to resonate, and we want people to pay for it in some way or at some point in time. That's what makes it a creative business, not simply like a creative practice or a hobby that you have, which is like beautiful. I love creative practices and hobbies. But if we want our creative business to make money, we have to, at some point, be engaging with this feedback without, as you're saying, it totally taking us off our own path. And so I love how you've put this. We have to know, what are the aspects that I'm not interested in feedback on, frankly, because I think this is the vision and this is what I'm staying true to. And then what are the pieces where, okay, great, I can do that. So even to share an example from within like the off the grid universe, like I feel so clear about what off the grid episodes are. Like, I have a vision and I execute that vision, and I love that it resonates with people. But I'm not typically asking for like a ton of feedback on like every episode or like what could be better. Like, I think it's excellent, and I'm like really committed to this, and I like feel like the vision is clear. But when I create the interweb, like for members, I ask for feedback a lot, and I take requests, and I'm kind of like, what do you want? What do you need? How can I really be like open and expansive in this space? And it's interesting actually, because like the off the grid is my creative practice. It's a free offering. Like, there's no exchange there. So I feel like it's in some sense for me easier to stay true to my vision. Interweb is a paid offering. It becomes the business side of things. And in that, I feel more open to feedback and shifting. But at the same time, there are kind of things that I have stayed true to and I won't change. Like, I have not launched a asynchronous community portal for the interweb because I've really wanted to stay true to the price point and how that relates to my energetic capacity. And I've felt like something that costs $10 a month, I can't commit to running a whole online community for it.
Sometimes it can be easy to think, well, okay, well, all my business is going to be something that I'm open to receiving feedback from my community because it's a paid offer. And then my hobbies or personal creative practice is where I'm like exploring and really focusing on my intuition. But what you're saying here is there are parts of the business that you consciously decided, this I'm open to, this is my space to play and I want to stay grounded in my own vision. So I love that you have that, both of those realities within the business space.
Hello, my lovely listener. Amelia here, interrupting this amazing conversation because if you're enjoying this episode, the one you're listening to right now, I think you would really love the Off the Grid Clubhouse. The Clubhouse is a paid podcast, newsletter, and asynchronous community space for friends and fans of Off the Grid hosted on Substack. It's where I share my monthly biz forecasts, bonus episodes about my hot takes, personal feelings, deepest, darkest, brightest, lightest ideas about online business, and more. I also send out a monthly link roundup called The Click Through, where I gather everything that I have been reading, watching, and intrigued by with regards to internet culture, social media happenings, and online business at large. That's also where I have been chronicling the many announcements I see lately of people taking breaks from social media or exiting platforms entirely. And all of the posts in the Clubhouse have community comment threads where you can ask me questions, share your experiences, and chat with other Off the Grid listeners. It only costs $5 per month or $50 per year to join the fun, and I truly hope that you will head to the show notes and check it out. I look forward to seeing you on Substack, but for now, let's dive back into this conversation. Something else just to bring social media back in briefly that I also think is important here is like the pace of the feedback. I think that with social media and like getting feedback on every post or every story or like having this sort of intensive pacing, I think we can get off our path faster than in places where the pacing is slower, right? So some podcast episodes I put out do so-so, but I don't really know that, honestly, for like 30 days. It like takes so much time for people to actually listen that I don't really look at all of the stats to compare episodes until the end of the season. And then I'm kind of like, okay, what did better or worse than other things? And that means that I have time to like receive the feed. Even if I'm just looking at a number, I have time to receive that feedback, integrate it, and then like make a plan for the future at a much slower pace than when I'm like analyzing how every single one of my Instagram posts did within 24 hours. And that, I think, for me has also helped me cultivate creative resilience, to take us back to today's topic, because when I slow down the pacing, my window of tolerance can stay open, to bring in that nervous system tool again. Like it can stay more open. It's not like immediately collapsing because of how one post did or one negative comment somewhere. I'm kind of able to sit with it and be with it. And that's an important practice for me to maintain it over time.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing here also is you're allowing yourself the space to feel into, how did it feel for me to post that or to record that? Like you're allowing yourself to check in with yourself first as to, did that feel like a success for me even before you get any type of feedback? Whereas on social media, it's so fast that you don't have this window to sit with yourself and even ask yourself, was that a success for me? Do I think that post is interesting or relevant or whatever that is? Was it fun for me to create? You don't even have that space to ask yourself those questions. It's so fast that it just puts you in a space where you need to always be dealing with that external type of validation.
Yeah, it's that external piece again. I love this question of like, does it feel like a success for you even before you share it? And like, have you spent enough time with it to figure that out? I think that earlier in my business, particularly, like I did a lot of just creating and sharing immediately because I had been so trained by social media to work in that way. And over the past few years, like my process has slowed down. I plan more in advance, but I also just create earlier so I can be with it before it's out in the public. Like this may sound completely outlandish to people, but most episodes of this podcast I have heard at minimum 3 times before they release. I have recorded them, I have edited them, and then a day or two later I've like gone for a walk and listened back and made additional notes and done a final cut and sent it out. And in terms of like a side project from my podcast production business. That is maybe an intense amount of time to be giving to the show. But like, it's just like, I love it. Like I do it not because I feel like I have to, but because I genuinely want to. And all of that time spent with it, like, is for me. I mean, it creates a more excellent, I think, product for listeners as well. It's for all of you too, but it's also for me to be with it. And slowing down that much has made my work so much better. Instead of just, the show would probably be fine if I just recorded it and released it. But that's not the pace I want to work at anymore. And I don't think it helps me cultivate that. Like when I take more time and make more space, I have more creative resilience. I can reimagine things. I can be with them longer. I can decide they're a success for me no matter how they do. And then when I do take in that feedback from the response or the download numbers, it's so much easier to stay grounded in my own experience because I've already decided it's a success.
Love that.
So, Pascale, I'm curious, kind of as we wrap up this conversation, what are some ways that you support clients to develop other creative skills? So creative resilience is one skill, but I'm curious, like, what are the other skills that we need to develop in our creative process? And like, how do you support people in building some of those?
There are so many different skills that we need to build along the path. And I think it kind of fits with the steps in a creative process, which is different for everyone. But I would say that what comes up often is intuition. So the ability to kind of listen to your own vision and voice. There's self-trust. So being able to take action and trust your instincts as you make decisions. And speaking about decisions, there's decision making is a very, very big one. I think a lot of people come to me feeling unclear. That's what they'll say. They need to find clarity. But more often than not, I would say it's just a matter of working that little decision-making skill. Usually they kind of know what the options are. It's just it's a bit of a struggle to make a decision. So decision-making is one of them. Courage, definitely, is one. And then resilience. I would say those are the ones that come up more often than not. And I work with clients in a private coaching capacity and partnerships ranging from a session to a 4-month container and more. And also in a community support where I host seasonal workshops and accountability series. And through that, what I'm helping my clients do is connect with their creative self and define their own vision, their own definition of success again. And then based on that, kind of see what are my own milestones, what are the steps to get there, and also kind of being aware of what obstacles might come our way so that we can build in advance some plan Bs or find some solutions. And through that process, it's really important for me to help them understand their own creative mind, their own creative nature, their process, their rhythms, so that we can build support systems and routines that really support who they are instead of pushing them to force fit into pre-imagined realities. And something really important that we do together, as you mentioned, is to build those skills, is to create those practices, to grow those muscles, creativity, curiosity, again, self-trust, intuition, resilience, all of those very important skills that we need in a creative practice, but also as business owners.
I think your work sounds just so nourishing and supportive. And we'll definitely link in the show notes to everything that you do. And members of the interweb will get to experience a workshop with you a little later this fall. You'll be joining us November 1st for a workshop on unearthing your creative essence and writing a creative manifesto that I'm super excited about. So thank you for that. Are there any kind of final ideas or words that you'd like to leave listeners with today?
Well, first, I'm very grateful for our conversation. It was a lot of fun. I think we could have talked about this for hours, and I'm very excited to be hosting that workshop in the interweb. I attended my first retreat at the interweb yesterday. It was so much fun, and I absolutely love the community, so I'm really excited about that. It's also on, I think, a new moon in Scorpio, so very interesting about transformation and kind of extracting the truth. So we'll get to the core of things to extract creative essence. So I'm very excited about that. I also have a podcast if ever you want to listen to it. It's Dear Creative Mind. And you can find out more about what I do on dearcreativemind.com. I don't hang out on Instagram so much, but you can still find me there if you would like to connect. And I think what I want to say to the listeners is just thank you for the unconventional ways that in maybe a very small way, they're trying to change something. There are so many structures and systems that are not serving us anymore and are causing so much harm. And I know that in some way, listeners to this podcast are doing their part in making some change. So I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you, Pascale, for joining us. Thank you, listeners, for listening and being a part of this conversation and in cultivating your own creative resilience. And I think that's it for today. So until next time, we will see you off the grid. Thanks for listening to Off the Grid. Don't forget to grab your free Leaving Social Media toolkit at offthegrid.fun/toolkit. This podcast is a Softer Sounds production. Our music is by Melissa Caitlin Carter of Making Audio Magic, and our logo is by Natelier Studio. I'm your host, Amelia Ruby, and until next time, I'll see you off the grid and on the interweb.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go